In the summer of 2025, Japan faced a crisis on multiple fronts. We're not just talking about a hot summer. We're talking about an event that shattered temperature records, threatened the nation's food supply, its economy, and a way of life that's been around for centuries. So let's break down what happened. This is a story of heat, a failing harvest, and the incredibly tough choices that a nation is now facing.
It all started with this number, 41.8 degrees Celsius. That's nearly 107 degrees Fahrenheit. On August 5th, 2025, this became the highest temperature ever recorded in Japan's history. I mean, to put that in perspective, one person in Tokyo said it was hotter than my bath. This wasn't just a heat wave. This was a national fever.
And that fever, well, it came with a truly devastating human cost. Just in the month of July, in the greater Tokyo area alone, more than 123 people died from heat-related causes. And you know what? That's probably a conservative estimate. The vast majority were elderly people, many of whom just didn't use their air conditioning, even if they had it. And the numbers just kept climbing. Across the entire country, in that very same month, over 37,000 people were hospitalized for heat stroke. Construction workers, students out for summer break, farmers in the field, nobody was safe. You can just imagine what that does to a country's emergency services. They were strained to the absolute limit. So what made this heat wave so exceptional? Look, this wasn't some one-off event, not a fluke. The country sweltered through its hottest April and its hottest July since they started keeping records way back in 1898. We're talking about a fundamental shift here, and it had consequences that went far beyond just being uncomfortably hot.
And those consequences struck right at the heart of Japanese culture, its diet, rice. You have to understand, this isn't just a grain in Japan. It's a foundational part of the daily meal. It's a cultural touchstone. And as the temperatures just kept soaring, the nation's most vital crops started to fail.
You can really hear the anxiety in the voice of farmers like Joji Terasaka. His words just show how all this abstract data was a devastating, day-to-day reality for people on the ground. It's this deep fear that the heat is fundamentally changing the nature of their work, of the very product they've spent their lives creating.
So what exactly is the heat doing to the rice? Well, it's pretty straightforward science. Once the temperature gets above 27 degrees Celsius, that's about 80 Fahrenheit, the rice plant basically gets heat stroke. It can't properly build up the starch inside the grain. What you get is this chalky, cracked, low-quality rice that's worth a lot less. And this isn't just an aesthetic problem. It directly leads to lower yields and, you guessed it, shortages.
Which brings us to a huge question. Okay, the heat damage explains why the rice quality was bad. But why were supermarket shelves literally empty? Why were stores putting up signs limiting how much rice people could buy? The heat wave was the trigger, for sure. But as we're about to see, it wasn't the only thing going on.
To really understand the full picture, we have to zoom out and look at the bigger forces at play. Scientists, of course, have been digging into the root causes of this extreme heat, and the evidence, well, it all points overwhelmingly in one direction: global climate change.
Now, to make that connection, scientists use this really fascinating tool called the Climate Shift Index, or CSI. The way it works is pretty cool. It lets them look at a specific, crazy hot day and calculate exactly how much more likely that day's temperature was because of human-caused climate change. It's like a fingerprint for climate's influence.
And what they found was pretty stark. In major cities like Tokyo and Kyoto, they recorded a CSI level of 4. That means the heat they were feeling was made at least 4 times more likely by climate change. In Kusatsu, it was a level 5. Meaning the heat was 5 times more probable. These aren't small numbers. This is climate change leaving its mark clear as day.
So how does this actually work? Well, think of it like a chain reaction. First, the Arctic is warming up super fast, which weakens the jet stream that circles the globe. A weak jet stream gets all wavy and buckled, and these buckles can create what are called heat domes. It's like putting a giant lid over a region, trapping hot air for weeks. At the same time, the ocean currents around Japan are also getting warmer, essentially surrounding the country in a blanket of heat.
But here's the thing.
The climate, as bad as it was, isn't the whole story. To find the other piece of the puzzle, we have to look at something much more surprising, and frankly, pretty controversial. A decades-old government policy that some experts say turned a really bad situation into a total catastrophe.
So let's ask that question again. Was the extreme heat the only cause of this massive rice shortage? The answer shows this really complex dance between nature and policy. Because while the heat was definitely damaging the harvest, something else had already been shrinking the supply. On purpose.
It's a policy called Gen-Tan. And get this, for decades, the Japanese government has been paying farmers subsidies to not grow rice on all their land. The whole goal was to prevent an oversupply, which would cause prices to crash and hurt farmers financially. And in a normal year, it kind of worked to keep the market stable.
But here's the catch. Critics argue that this Gen-Tan policy created a system with absolutely no slack, no buffer for a bad year. Japan was already running a tight supply by design, so when the heat wave came along and damaged the smaller amount of crops that were planted, the system just snapped. There simply wasn't enough rice to go around.
So all of this has forced Japan to take a long, hard look in the mirror. The crisis exposed these deep vulnerabilities, but it also kicked off a race to find solutions. The question now is whether Japan can innovate its way out of a problem that's part climate, part policy, and part deeply ingrained tradition.
A huge part of the solution is technology. You've got this battle going on. On one side, there's Koshi hickory rice. It's the traditional, beloved variety that everyone knows, but it's super vulnerable to heat damage. And on the other side, you have these new strains like Sino Kizuna, which are basically super rice engineered to thrive in this new climate, resisting heat, pests, and even typhoons. But here's the rub. You can have the greatest technology in the world, but someone has to actually use it. And this is where we hit a massive human roadblock. The average age of a Japanese rice farmer is 69. Let that sink in for a second.
And that one number leads to a whole cascade of problems. Adoption of these new, tougher varieties is incredibly slow. We're talking only about 15% of fields have switched over. Many of these older farmers are, understandably, reluctant to change the methods they've used their entire lives. Add to that the fact that it takes about 10 years to develop a new rice strain, and that there's hardly anyone from the younger generation moving to these rural areas to take over the farm.
And the words of one community leader from a farming village, they're just chilling, "We are heading toward extinction." This really drives home that the crisis isn't just about rice anymore. It's about the potential extinction of the farming communities themselves. It's a battle against time, demographics, and a climate that's changing faster than anyone expected.
So this is where Japan stands now, at a real crossroads, caught between its cherished traditions and the urgent, desperate need for innovation. The summer of crisis put the challenge right out in the open, leaving us all with one final, massive question.